First of all, I just want to thank Vicki, PBS NewsHour Extra, for hosting these. I say this every time, and I can't say it enough. It's just been such a source of light and a place of relief and release at times for teachers and school staff and lovers of teachers and school staff across the country and the globe. And so I just want to thank you for carving out this space and time for us several times a month. And I am extremely thrilled, if that's, I have to be as extremely thrilled to have Senator Spearman and Kate Kelly here. Ever since I was in grade school, I remember being obsessed with the Equal Rights Amendment. I think my mom and dad are here tonight. I wrote a book report on it in the 1980s because I was 2 at the time. Just kidding. And I've always, I've been passionate about it my whole life. And it's really, really crazy that it's 2021 and we still have not added the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. But we are here tonight to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment with, I can't think of 2 more amazing, informed women who have been at the forefront of this fight in the modern era to get the Equal Rights Amendment, the 28th Amendment, added to the Constitution. And this is the time. It's going to happen. And this is one of those positive Zooms where we have something to celebrate that's about to happen. But I want to make sure that the reason we're doing this tonight is that we want your students to learn about this. There's so many adults who still don't know that the Equal Rights Amendment never was ratified. There's a lot of people that are well educated who are like, wait, the Equal Rights Amendment, that's not in the Constitution. And so our students might not know that either, I'm going to guess. So I think it's really an amazing opportunity to hear from 2 of the experts today. And I'm just so excited about it. And so the way these Zooms work is I'm going to interview Kate Kelly and Senator Pat Spearman for the first 15 to 20 minutes. And I promise not to hog them too much. And then the audience is also our guests. And so start typing out your questions in the chat and feel free to keep typing them if we don't see them, because there's going to be a lot of questions. Don't feel like you're being pushy. And so once I speak, I have a couple questions for the Senator and Kate. And then once we have our conversation, you're going to get the opportunity to put your video on if you wish and ask Kate and the Senator your questions about the Equal Rights Amendment. And the goal is to bring this back to the classroom, whether you're a student who's watching or a parent or a teacher, educator, school staff member. Let's take what we learned tonight and spread the knowledge and get this amendment added as the 28th Amendment. All right. So let me introduce our guests. So first we have, and I mean, our guests need no introduction, but I still want to do it because I love them. So Kate Kelly is a feminist, activist, and human rights lawyer. She founded Ordain Women. I mean, I can also, by the way, these are modified biographies. These are 2 guests that we could spend the hour talking about their achievements. So just keep that in mind. So Kate, among many things that she's done in her career so far, is she founded Ordain Women, an organization advocating for the ordination of women to the priesthood in the Church of Latter-day Saints. And you probably know her for her work as a human rights lawyer as well. And she's also, of course, nationally known as an advocate, a fierce advocate for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. When I was reading your bio again, I learned that when you graduated from law school in 2012, that's when you just hit the ground running, advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment, and you haven't looked back since. And that's among all the other things that you've been doing in your career. And our second guest is Senator Pat Spearman. She is a member of the Nevada State Senate, and she represents District 1. When she was elected in 2012, that there's a theme here, she became the first openly lesbian member of the Nevada Legislature. She currently serves as a co-majority whip. And before being elected senator, she actually served in the US Army for 3 decades. So let's all thank the senator for her service. She's also a pastor, and she has introduced many bills as senator that provide equal pay for women, support LGBTQ+ community and rights, and also bills to support veterans. In 2015, as state senator, she began the push for the Nevada state legislature to ratify the ERA. 2 years later, spoiler, I'm sure you all know this, the Nevada ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. So let's get into it. So I have questions. We're going to go back and forth between Kate and the senator, and then get your questions ready, because I'm sure I'm not going to ask all of the questions you have. So my first question is for Kate. Simple. And I don't mean to insult anyone with this question, but let's just make sure we define our terms. I'm such a teacher. So Kate, break it down for us. What is the Equal Rights Amendment exactly? And how has it not made it into the Constitution yet?
Yeah, thank you for doing this. Thank you for having me. Thank you for teaching and doing the incredible work that you do. One of my best friends from elementary school had me on a couple weeks ago to do Zoom teaching for her class, and I was exhausted after an hour. So I appreciate everything that you're doing and the incredible work you're doing to teach the next generation. So thank you so much. The Equal Rights Amendment is pretty simple in its language. The primary clause of the Equal Rights Amendment is just 24 words. Equality of rights shall not be abridged or denied by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it. There are two other clauses, and we can go into more depth about what those mean if you want to. But at the end of the day, it's a very, very simple amendment. Most amendments are. And what the Equal Rights Amendment will do is put gender into the Constitution. It will protect, it will essentially make the right to be free from discrimination a constitutional right on the basis of sex. And right now, that is not a right we have. So there is the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment has been used. There's a legal term that they use called penumbras, which means, I have now learned, sort of a version of the shadow. It's a scientific term for sort of the edge of the shadow. And in this edge of the shadow, the Supreme Court justices have since used this penumbra effect in the 14th Amendment to find rights that didn't exist before and aren't explicitly in the Constitution. So I also kind of call it shimmying. It's like, okay, we shimmied our way into the Constitution. Thank God to people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who all along the way were fighting for this theory that women were already included in the Constitution under the 14th Amendment. And I also have to give credit to Polly Murray. Polly Murray is a pioneering transgender legal theorist and scholar and Episcopal priest and incredible person. And Polly Murray actually came up with the theory to litigate women into the 14th Amendment. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg credited Polly Murray in her first brief to the Supreme Court in Reed versus Reed. And so while we these were working sort of on parallel tracks. The Equal Rights Amendment was first introduced into Congress in 1923. It was started being drafted in 1921. So we're literally 100 years out from the amendment being conceived and introduced into Congress. It was actually introduced, this is a fun fact, it was introduced into Congress by Susan B. Anthony's nephew. So he was from Kansas, and he was a legislator at that point, and he was in the House, and he introduced it into the House in 1923. Fast forward, and there's a lot of really interesting things happening in the interim decades, but we only have so much time on this Zoom. So it gets passed in both houses of Congress in 1972. It is wildly popular. In the House, I believe it passed by 93%. So it's just like almost unanimous support. And I think there are only 8 senators who vote against it. Can you imagine today anything that has to do with gender? Where only 8 senators vote against it? It's almost unthinkable.
It's unthinkable.
And so we get it passed in both houses of Congress, and it's again wildly popular. Hawaii ratifies it on the same day, like 30 minutes later. It's immediately ratified by 22 states. What happens? We know that according to Article 5 of the US Constitution, we have to have 3/4 of the states, so that's 38. Uh, States continue to ratify, but this parallel track is working in the Supreme Court, where Ruth Bader Ginsburg is kind of trying to take these cases and move them forward, because she doesn't know. She doesn't know if we're going to get the Equal Rights Amendment or not. No one did. And so the Equal Rights Amendment moves through these state legislatures very quickly and starts to taper off. And in the middle of that decade is really when what's called the Long Southern Strategy starts to be implemented. So the Long Southern Strategy, in addition to racism, is anti-feminism and Christian nationalism. And these things are used in the South to permanently turn flip those states red. Of course, they went back and forth in the middle of the decade. So there needed to be something else. In addition to horrifying racism, we needed something else in order to complete the Long Southern Strategy. And so part of that Long Southern Strategy was anti-feminism. And the real hallmark of that was the Equal Rights Amendment and opposing the Equal Rights Amendment. So whereas white Southern women had initially supported the Equal Rights Amendment through the decade, towards the end, the majority opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. So we can talk about that movement if we want later. But essentially the deadline that they put in initially with the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1979 was about to expire. So they decided, incredible, at this point we have incredible women in Congress. So we have, Shirley Chisholm, we have Patsy Mink, we have, Barbara Jordan, we have all of these women. They're arguing for the extension. So they said, let's forget about that deadline. Let's extend the deadline, which they did. So they passed in Congress a deadline. They extended it from 1979 to 1982. In 1982, we still fell 3 states short. And that is where we fell for many, many, many years, even decades. And there were some people along the way who never gave up. Some of those people are on this call tonight. Eileen Davis from Virginia is one of them. Many other folks who stuck with the ERA through what's called the doldrums, a time where there wasn't a lot of movement on it. And then in many of the states, unratified states, there were people moving it forward. We had a bill after Trump's election. A lot of people realized, like, wait a minute, we don't have the rights we thought we had. We thought we were equal. And now we realize, like, we are toast. And so there were women's marches and big momentum. We had a bill in Utah, where I'm from, did not get out of committee for obvious reasons, and supermajority in that legislature. But there is one place where they did get the Equal Rights Amendment out of committee and onto the floor, and had waged an incredible battle, and that state is Nevada. That fight was led by Senator Pat Spearman, who is joining us here tonight. And so Pat, along with the activists who brought it to her attention, really resurrected the 3-state strategy. And so again, fast forward, Nevada ratified, and Pat can talk more about that. Then Illinois ratified, and in 2020, just last year, Virginia was the final state to ratify, the final state needed. So some people argue we have it. It is the 28th Amendment. It is no longer the Equal Rights Amendment. It is the 28th Amendment to the US Constitution. Other people, unfortunately, don't see it that way, and we can talk more about that. But at the end of the day, we are just so close, closer than we've ever been to getting it ratified.
Thank you. That was the most amazing recap of such a century-long history in, I think it was 6 minutes. And wow, I'm glad we're recording this. I'm going to play it for my students tomorrow or whenever we have the recording. Thank you. That was incredible. And so, which brings me to Senator Spearman. So Senator Spearman, first of all, I mean, my question for you is, why is it still important to get it ratified? And I actually, so I want to ask you that. And then alongside that, why did you make it such a priority in Nevada to push this through and get us past that doldrum period?
So thank you all. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks for everybody who took the time out to be a part of this. I remember when I taught school way back when, just after the dinosaurs roamed the earth. I was teaching, trying to do this all day and then trying to do something else in the afternoon. So let me say this, because I'm often asked that question, why was it so important? It was important to me because equality is important to me. Equality is important to me, and unless everyone has it, no one has it. Yesterday, on the Senate floor in Nevada, we passed the Nevada State Equal Rights Amendment, and I've asked my legislative assistant to drop the link in the chat so you all can see it. And we had someone who said, well, you don't need the Equal Rights Amendment. You know, the same argument, it's not necessary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there was something that he said that set me off, and I couldn't come back. I couldn't get back from where he set me off to. I'm Black, I'm a woman, and I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. There's no way I can escape prejudice, sexism, racism, and homophobia. No place I can go. And so all of me yearns not just to be free, but to be recognized as equal. I grew up at a time when there were signs on water fountains that said colored and white. I grew up in a time when I was almost suspended or expelled from school in Alabama. My sister and I and a few other African-American students were the first to integrate high school in Hopeville, Alabama. And the principal threatened to expel me because I wouldn't let people call me. And I know this is going to be crass, but I really need to say this. I would not let other students call me a nigger, and I would not allow the teachers that were teaching Alabama history to get Negro wrong and call it Negra. And so I was going to be expelled. In Alabama, there were still signs that said, we don't serve colored people. There were signs on Dairy Queens that said, go to the back. If you're not white, go to the back. And so, all of those things are very real to me, and they cause a visceral reaction whenever someone tries to allude to the fact that, well, we don't really need the ERA. Look at all the things we have. And and so that sets me off. It's important to me. It was important to me in 2014. I didn't know that it still had a chance to be ratified. And Jeanette Dean called me and said, Senator, will you carry the ERA? And I was like, the what? And she said, the Equal Rights Amendment. I said, is it still? She said, yeah, we can still pass it. And so that's all I needed to hear. And Helene Swanson brought it to her after she walked across the country. And so I always give credit to them because it wasn't me by myself. It was important to me to get the ERA passed here in Nevada because it was important to me to say again, equality under the law matters. And I think the thing that trips people up, and Kate read, it's like 24 words, you cannot be abridged on account of sex. So let me just say this, whenever you say sex, people's heads explode. And I don't know why it is. They just like, oh my God, they said sex, and one of my colleagues said yesterday, well, why does it say sex? Does that mean that boys can go into the girls' bathroom again? And, and I don't know why they had to say sex. And I wanted to stand up and say, because that's what they used during that day. If it was iPhone, they would have said on the count of iPhone. So just understand that was the genre of the day. And once we get the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution, I believe that it not only lifts women, I believe that it not only helps women, but I believe that it helps all oppressed people. And we were very explicit in Nevada when we worded our Equal Rights Amendment. And you will see in our Equal Rights Amendment, we included LGBTQ, we included, everybody that's been left behind and left out. The Equal Rights Amendment is important, but we keep getting pushback, and notice who the pushback is coming from. The pushback is coming from, and I mean this in the kindest way, the pushback is coming from white men who have been sheltered and were born in privilege and have no idea what it feels like to be discriminated against. Now, that's not all white men, okay? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that principally the people who try to stop us are people who have privilege. They can go into a grocery store, they can walk down the street, they can do whatever. And they've been able to do that all their lives. They've never had to ask people permission to enter a room. They've never had somebody walk up to them and say, what are you doing in this room? Because when they walk into a room, people automatically assume you should be here. But me, on the other hand, and people that look like me, on the other hand, will always ask, why are you here? And so equality matters. But if you have not lived my experience and have the ability to look through the lens of my experience, you don't even know what we're talking about. And so they start from the false premise that, oh, well, we don't need that because everybody's equal. Wrong. No one is. And well, we've got this law in this state, but laws can be changed because one legislature cannot bind succeeding legislatures. And so what that means, if it's not in the Constitution, a law can be changed. That's why we have a patchwork of laws for pay equity. That's why we have a patchwork of laws that protect women who have been laws for all those things. If we had the ERA, it would present a higher level of scrutiny. And it's not just that you hurt me, but it's a matter that you violated my constitutional right. And so it's important. It's important. And we should never forget that. And I say this all the time. So let me just say this in case nobody asks me. I don't care what they do. I don't care what they say. The judge a couple of weeks ago said, yeah, it's done, it's toast, you can't do it anymore. And some people asked me, said, well, what do you think? I said, don't listen to him. Don't listen to him. There are a lot of people that said, oh, the earth is flat, the earth is flat. Well, somebody didn't listen to them. All right. And so don't listen to them. We know that we deserve to have our equality in the Constitution. And it's not about giving me equal rights. It's about recognizing that I'm already equal and recognize those equal rights. And so don't listen to anybody that tells you we can't do it, because together we will get this done. We will not stop until we get it done. We will not retreat until we get it done. So don't listen to the people, the naysayers. We're going to get it done. And we're going to get it done because ain't no stopping us now. That's what I got to say.
Oh my God. I love that. And I think that's so important to keep in mind, because there's been so many moments in history. I'm a history teacher, so I teach them, where someone came up with the idea, had ideas. Yeah. Like the earth is flat. Nope, it's not. And you sounded crazy for saying that. And guess what? Justice ultimately wins, right? The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And there are times when it's hard to imagine that. And we lived through 4 years of that, I would argue, just recently, right? And here we are. So thank you. So I think this is for Kate, because I want to go back to, you were talking about all the naysayers, right? What I've noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong, it feels like, well, actually, I want to go back to something that I think I want to make sure everyone understands. Let's talk about the nitty gritty, the nuts and bolts of how the Equal Rights Amendment can actually make it into the Constitution now. Because I know that there's two paths, right? Kate, can you speak to those two paths in a simple way as possible? Because it gets a little into administrative process. Yeah, can you talk about that a bit?
I mean, I think it's a very exciting thing to teach to kids, because it's important, or students of all ages, because it's important to understand that the Constitution is not static, that we learn about it, that we have a pocket Constitution, but that document can change. And so that's kind of how, when I'm talking to younger audiences, that's how I frame it. If you read Article 5 of the Constitution, the men who wrote the Constitution, and they were all men, put in a way to change it. And so if you're talking about the founders' intent, I mean, they put in the way to change it. And so we are just doing the thing that the founders of this country put in to change and modernize the document. So at this point, we've met that threshold. With Virginia, we now have 38 states. The question is, there are two kind of like outstanding legal questions, and I can get more into this, but I'll just give a really simple explanation. The first question is the deadline. So is the deadline valid? And if the deadline is valid, do those 3 additional states count? There are lots of opinions about this. But like Pat said, all of the opinions that say the deadlines count are wrong. And this is why, because there's a lot of reasons why it's wrong. One is, of course, that Article 5 itself has no deadlines. So arguably, there is no timeline. There can be no timeline. Now, of course, the Supreme Court says that it has to be somewhat contemporaneous. Well, what is the 27th Amendment to the Constitution? Does anyone know? The answer is no, probably, because it's just an amendment about pay raises for Congress. But the important thing about the 27th Amendment is that amendment is called the Madison Amendment because it was literally by James Madison.
203 years later.
Sorry?
203 years from start to finish.
Yes. So 203 years later, that amendment was ratified in the 90s. And, there was a lot of uproar about congressional pay, and it was kind of in the news, and it got this movement going. And it's actually a very interesting story, which I have a podcast. It's called Ordinary Equality. And if you want the 20-hour version of the ERA, you should listen to the podcast. I have an entire episode about that. But the point is, the Equal Rights Amendment has only been 40 years. The 27th Amendment was over 200 years. And so if 200 years is not too long, then why is a couple decades, especially when it's something so much more important than congressional pay raises. And then the second issue, I think, is something that a lot of people talk about, or people who oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, are rescissions. So in that remember how I was talking about that final couple years of the 70s? In that final couple years of the 70s, the Equal Rights Amendment went from being wildly popular on the platform of both political parties, supported by all, really just huge bipartisan support. End of the decade, is this really controversial partisan issue. So some states that got caught up in the yay equality of the early 70s, then decided to try to rescind their ratifications. They had already ratified, and then they tried to take those they tried to rescind those ratifications. I say tried because it's actually not possible to rescind your ratifications. For the 14th Amendment, 2 states, Ohio and New Jersey, attempted to rescind, but those rescissions were not counted, and Congress just listed them as the ratifying states, including those 2 states, and no one would seriously argue today that the 14th Amendment doesn't exist or isn't part of the Constitution. So it's pretty clear that you can't rescind, that a ratification is a one and done. Once you've done it, it's done and you ratified. And so those are the legal issues that are kind of working their way through the courts and through Congress. But I think the most important thing to remember is these are just procedural hurdles, and those things can change. What people who oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, they don't care about the deadlines. They don't care, that's not what they actually care about. What they want is to keep equality out of the Constitution.
I just wrote that down to remind everyone it's been decided you cannot rescind. And I'm from New Jersey. I'm very disappointed in New Jersey, but we'll deal with that later. So I want to actually, so thank you. That was perfectly explained. And now I think we can all bring it back to our students. And I really love your suggestion. And I'm going to ask a question later about what should we highlight when we teach this to our students? And I really think I agree. It's so important to teach about how the Constitution changes. We call it the unwritten Constitution in our New York State curriculum, and I'm sure in other ones as well. But I think it's also important to talk about how, the Constitution was designed to go with the times, the elastic clause, etc. So thank you for that tip. I want to actually, so I think most of us are familiar with the arguments that were circulating in the 70s during that era against the Equal Rights Amendment. They're going to make you go fight in a war, etc. They're going to draft you, and all these other arguments. But Senator Spearman, not to bring up the naysayers, but I'm going to. What are the top 3, even if they're horrible? What are the 3 main arguments you heard when you were getting the amendment ratified in Nevada? What were the arguments? What are the big arguments against the ERA these days?
Thank you. So the one that kept reoccurring, and I think they thought that if they said that this was frivolous and it really didn't mean anything, it was called a stunt, And they said, whatever vote we have, it will be just symbolic. And so it won't really matter. And I tackled that on the floor when I asked my colleagues, I said, for those of you who are married, I'd like for you to look at your left hand, the third finger, and you should have something on that finger. And that's not your husband, that's not your wife sitting on your hand. But when people look at that ring, it is a symbol that you are married. And every day in this room, in this gallery, we turn and face that flag, and we pledge allegiance to a flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it is a symbol. Okay? Does anybody doubt that, the veracity that this is a symbol and how powerful this symbol is? No. And so I'm a Christian. When I put on a cross, that is a symbol to people that I am a Christian. Some people who have other religious faiths or beliefs, have the Star of David, what. And so these are symbols. So don't tell me that symbols aren't powerful. They are, because they convey a message about something that I believe in that's higher and bigger than I am. But that symbol is important. The next thing that they want to say is, well, it's going to mean that women will have to go to war. And to that, my counter was, you do understand that women have been fighting in wars since before the United States existed. You do understand that there were women fighting in the Civil War. And you do understand that many of the women who fought in the Civil War were Black women. I don't know how many of you all have seen the movie Harriet, but Harriet Tubman, fought in that war. With Vietnam, the war that we never want to talk about. But there were women in Vietnam. Most of them were called nurses. Right now in Afghanistan and in Iraq, wherever we are in armed combat, women are there. And somebody said, well, it'll mean that they have to go into the military. I was like, go into the military? I almost spent 30 years in there. Hello, come on. Somebody read my bio before you get up here and talk like that. And then, the other piece was, well, if we pass this, then that means that women can't get their husband's Social Security. And I'm like, okay, come on, people. I know that a drowning person will reach for a stick, but really? And our legal department had already said that is not true. That is not true. But here's something that I bet no one has ever heard. So one person comes to the table and with a very straight face, talks about doing research on sexes. And there are now some 4,000 different sexes in the world, in the dictionary. And so if it's 4,000 sexes and we do this right here because it says sex, then that means that women could marry the Eiffel Tower. And I'm like, Jesus, please tell me that you banned your kids from looking at this hearing. They do not want to know that you're out here embarrassing them like this. The Eiffel Tower, come on. So all of the arguments against are always just rehashed. We know what they mean. And they have been disproven by time. And last but not least, I've never been in a hearing arguing for the ERA that I didn't hear this. Well, the ERA is going to mean that men can go into the girls' bathroom. Do you really want men in the same bathroom with your little girl? And I'm like, okay, this is a bridge too far. Okay? Because it's not about men going into the bathroom. And said, well, they don't look like men. What they've actually done is they've decided to change their sex, but God already ordained what they were. And I'm like, come on, y'all, come on. Okay? And so immediately when they go to those go to those emotional hot buttons, because when you don't want to do something, any excuse will do. It doesn't matter what they say. They just don't want to do it. And so, I prepare for those kinds of arguments, and I always end with this. Equality was not something that was guaranteed to the generation before me. My parents were in their 30s before they actually had the right to vote. My grandmother was in her 60s before she had the right to vote. And even when she thought she had the right to vote, there was still a poll tax. There was still questions. She'd show up and, how many jelly beans are in that jar? How many black jelly beans? It didn't matter what she said. They were always going to be the same. And so when we talk about rights, again, equality is not something you need to give to me. I'm fighting because you need to recognize my equality. And so when you look at the Vietnam veterans who came back and there was something seriously wrong, and people kept saying, no, it's in your head. But they fought until they got the type of health care that they needed. The people in the civil rights movement fought until we got the voting rights. When you stop and you look at the migrant workers, Cesar Chavez, he started this thing. Well, we're not going to stop until we get the right. I mean, we've got to have working conditions that respect our humanity. Every time rights have been fought for, they've never come easy. And this one will not either. So recognize the naysayers are out there and the arguments are warmed over from the 70s, but check it out. You don't need to bring ketchup, mustard, and onions for those arguments. Just dispel them. We will not listen to you because all of those arguments have been proven false. We will get the ERA. We will get it.
Thank you so much. I'm so inspired.
I hope I answered your question.
No, you did, and you answered like all the other questions, so we can call it a night. I'm just kidding. Well, so there's a bunch of questions in here. I definitely want to make sure that Kate talks about the work that she did in Utah, which is a different kind of case study compared to what happened with the senator in Nevada. Let's get to that, but I want to open it up to the group and not hog you, which I have been doing. Lisa, I actually asked Lisa's question, but she has a really good follow-up question to it because I had asked you about the arguments against the ERA. Lisa, want to jump in and elaborate on your question related to the arguments in the ERA?
I just think students love to hear that this is even a debate, and you have to prove it to them. So what meaningful arguments could you give to sixth graders to allow them to see that this is something that was a legitimate debate or was considered one and not just a smokescreen? Or was it just a smokescreen?
So I think it's hard for us to provide the arguments against because we're so in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment. But I think it's important to remember that everyone, like the senator said, everyone who opposes equality, I mean, you don't have a good argument. I'm sorry, you don't. I think part of the, it's very framed. If you've seen the mini series Mrs. America, it's very framed as though women themselves are their worst enemies, and and there's like drama between women, which if you've been a part of the women's movement, is true. That is always a part of our struggle. But I think the real you have to think about the motives behind everything. So for students, I think maybe it's helpful for them to think through the motives. So like, why would someone not want boys and girls to be equal? What would they benefit from? And they can think through, and they're very smart, as you know. So some of those answers are insurance companies. In the 1970s, insurance companies are really attributed by historians to have killed the ERA, to funding the anti-ERA fight. Phyllis Schlafly is sort of the figurehead, but who funded her? Who gave her money? Who flew her around? Who paid for her legal research? Who printed her flyers? That was men. And Phyllis Schlafly ran for office twice in Illinois and never won. So Phyllis Schlafly never actually voted against the Equal Rights Amendment. The people who voted against the Equal Rights Amendment were almost exclusively men in state legislatures. And so it's not true to say that women killed the Equal Rights Amendment. I think there's big interests. So there's money interests. That includes, of course, like I said, insurance companies. That includes other companies who are like, do we really want to pay women equally? This is quite a bargain for us to pay half of our workforce significantly less for the same amount of work. And so I think you just have students think through like what the incentives are and what the incentives always have been for people to oppose equality. And almost all of those also apply to the Equal Rights Amendment.
Thank you so much. Excellent.
Can I just chime in? Because, Kate just mentioned something. Today is Equal Pay Day.
Uh-huh.
This is the day that white women will have earned as much as their white male counterparts in 12 months. If I were talking to sixth graders, this is what I would probably do. I would have one of the young ladies to stand up, and I'd have one of the young men to stand up. And I would say to them, I want you to start walking. I'd have a line, want you to start walking. And once you reach that line, then stop. But I have also put labels on these lines, and one says boys and the other says girls. When you reach that line, stop. And they would notice visually that the boys got there first. And they would also notice visually how much further they had to walk. This is Equal Pay Day, but guess what? Black women are going to be into April before it's Equal Pay Day. And Latinas, closer to the end of April or maybe even May. That is not the kind of legacy we want to leave our children. And so for sixth graders, I would say to them, both of y'all, or everybody that's going to college, you're going to go to college. You're going to pay the same amount to go to college. One day, you all are going to graduate. Maybe you go to the same college, you graduate on the same day, but check this out. When you go to work, because you are a woman, if we do not have the Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution, you will not get paid the same as your male counterpart. And I can just hear some of the sassy girls saying, you ain't gonna do me like that. And so, help them to visualize this is real. And the Equal Rights Amendment, yes, it's about recognizing equality, but it's also an economic argument, because most families anymore are either headed by a single mother, or it is the woman that is bringing in most of the money. And you only have to look at the numbers in this pandemic in terms of those people who have lost jobs. And anytime I see a headline that says more women have lost jobs in the pandemic than men, something done gone bad wrong in our country, right? And so these are the examples, the current day examples of why we must have the Equal Rights Amendment. We've got to have it. It's because of equality, but it's also an economic argument.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that was one of my questions that I had written out later on the day about Equal Pay Day, because it's so, I went on a rant last night on Twitter about, just Equal Pay Day and everything you were just saying. And it's just yet another argument for why we need women's equality in the Constitution. So thank you so much for tying that in. And also, that's such a great lesson idea. And it could work in a K through 12 classroom. I think visually representing that physically in a space, once we're back in a physical space, is so important for kids to see and for grownups to see. So thank you for that. Catherine has a question for you about Nevada. I wanted to quickly ask Kate, though, go back to Kate. So you had a different experience in Utah for various reasons. I want to spin it in a positive way. What do you think was your most compelling argument in Utah that got some folks agreeing with you or starting to see the reason why it might be a good idea to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment?
So yeah, it's a very unique state, and it's actually the worst state in the United States for women. So by almost every measurable category, that includes wage gap, that includes women on professional boards, that includes women's participation in politics. It's always coming in last. Highest statistics for rape and sexual assault. Like, it's really just the worst state in the United States for women. Like I said, every measurable category. And so it's an uphill battle in a place like that, and with a super majority of one party and honestly one religion. But I think one of the most compelling arguments, and they do have a bill, they had a bill again this year. It actually had a Senate sponsor this year. So it is making progress little by little. And I think one of the most compelling, there are two things. One, in Utah, they have a state ERA. actually. So like Pat was saying, they're going to pass a state ERA in Nevada. Utah has always had a state ERA. And that has that could be a whole nother lesson plan. But Utah women actually were the first to vote in the United States. So Wyoming got the vote first, but Utah had the first election. So the first actual woman to vote in a government election in the United States was actually Brigham Young's granddaughter. I think her name is Eliza Young. And so, so it's one of these arguments where like, we already have this as a state, so why would we not want it as a nation? It's kind of like the reverse of the states' rights argument, where it's like, if this would be left up to us, we already have it in our constitution, so why would we not want it in the federal constitution? And then I think another argument that really appeals to a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle is that, particularly people of faith, is that, of all faiths, but particularly in this context, Mormons, is that, God treats everyone the same and that we are all equal in the eyes of God. It's kind of what Pat was talking about, is that we're not actually asking to be equal. We are equal. What we're asking is that our equality be recognized by the state. And I think that's also important for kids to understand outside of a religious context, that we aren't saying that men and women won't be equal until they're recognized in the Constitution. Men and women are equal. Boys and girls are equal. We know that, you can feel that, your parents have taught you that, hopefully. And so what we want is the equality we have and the equality we recognize to be reflected in this document. This document does not mean whether or not you are equal. You are. But what we want is for it to be recognized.
Thank you. And that's so, I think it's always so important to remind people of that fact that the first woman to vote was in Utah. Really important.
I just remembered her name. It's Sarah Young, actually.
S-E-A-P-H. Young. Yes. So Catherine has a question. So I'm going to go to Catherine and I'm going to toss it to Liz. Catherine has a question for the senator about the work she did to get the ERA ratified in Nevada. And then Liz has a very relevant and topical question and point to make related to the recent viral video from the female basketball player and from the NCAA as it relates to the ERA. So Catherine, can you jump in with your question for the senator?
Yes.
Thanks.
So, hi, Senator. It's great to talk to you. I had a question about how the bill was passed or how the ERA was passed in Nevada. Unfortunately, I'm unfamiliar with the breakdown of the Senate in your state as far as political divides. And do you see a path forward in other states? Is this ERA something that can gain bipartisan support? I'm in a very conservative state, Tennessee. We have a Republican supermajority. It's mostly white men. And I really want something like this to pass in my state, but I know that in Nevada, you had to put in a tremendous amount of work. Can you tell me a little bit about what it took to get it passed?
So thank you. Here's the thing. I bought the bill in 2015, and the jurisdiction is in the Committee on Legislative Operations and Elections. I'm a Democrat, we did not own either house. And so that meant that we were not chairing any committees. So the committee heard the bill. And I kept asking, so when are you going to vote it out? When are you going? So we'll do it. And there is a day in the legislature on a calendar when any bill that has not been voted out of committee dies. And so on the very last day, the very last hour of that day, they said to me, we're not going to vote it out because we don't think it's necessary. And when they were saying this to me, there were women in the hallway, many of whom were in their either late 70s or early 80s, and you could hear like wailing in the halls. just crying. And I mean, they were like so disappointed. One lady said, she said, I thought that I would see this in my lifetime, but I don't think I am. And I said to them, next time when I get reelected, we'll get it done next time. Okay. And so you can't start and then get disappointed and disengage. What you have to do is you have to recognize what your goal is, and you just keep going. It really doesn't matter what they say and who says what. And so in 2016, I was reelected. And on the very first day of our session, he was our Senate Majority Leader. He's now our Attorney General for the state. Senator Aaron Ford stood up and he said, there's some things we're going to get done this time, and I need to put you all on notice. Number one, we will ratify the ERA. Number two, we will have an equal pay bill. And so that brought life into the people who thought it wouldn't happen. It was a struggle, and it was horrible to watch the women in the hallway just crying. I mean, it was like crying their hearts out. And I thought to myself, how can you all do this? How can you do this? Anybody human, how can you do this to people? All you had to do was tell me 3 weeks ago, we're going to hear it, but we're not going to do anything with it. Don't wait till the very last minute, to tell me we're not going to do it. But indeed, waiting till the last minute energized a lot of people, because they recognized that but for the people who chaired the committee and the majority of people who were on the committee, we would have had the ERA ratified in 2015. And so they went to work. And here's what I say, and those of you in Virginia know that I said the same thing in Illinois. If you cannot change their minds, change their seats. And I understand that, Tennessee has a super majority, but guess what? There are more and more young people who are eligible to vote. And so I would encourage you to, and I'm trying to remember the name of the group. There's a young group, there's a young people's group started by someone who I think she's a sophomore in high school, but register them to vote. Register them and get them to the polls. And because, people who are in I don't know what generation are we in, X, Y, or Z? We're in whatever generation we're in right now, okay? So,
we are in Generation Z.
Generation Z. Okay. So listen, that generation is looking around and they're wondering, so what's the problem? They don't understand why people don't understand. They don't understand this. They're looking around at it just like my generation looked at slavery and said, how can you do that? And so if you can get them registered and make sure they get to the polls. See, a lot of people, they're traveling in my time zone, they're not thinking about Gen Z. They're not thinking about millennials. They're not. They are looking at the people that they say, this is the voting block we have to focus on, 45 and above. If you get back and get those who are 18 to 25, I guarantee you that a change will come to Tennessee, and they will be glad to do it. And the people who get kicked out of office because they didn't appreciate equality, they'll get kicked out so fast, they'll be wondering, where's the GPS to tell me where I am?
I love that. So Senator Spearman, thank you so much for bringing up Gen Z. I'm Gen X, but I'm an honorary Gen Z, according to all my students, because I make them say that. So I just wanted to say that you were mentioning Generation Ratified. They're the Gen Z arm of the ERA movement. And we also have Santiago here tonight. I don't know if anyone here is here from Generation Ratify. We invited them. If they're not, they'll be watching later. And Generation Ratify is teamed up with Voters of Tomorrow, which is a bipartisan nonprofit group that, and Santiago's here. He can chime in the chat and tell you more about Voters of Tomorrow. They're planning an event on Sunday specifically to get Gen Z mobilized and activated around the Equal Rights Amendment. So if you have any students or if you're interested in attending, Santiago will drop it in the chat. And I told Kate about it. And I think I invited Senator Spearman to attend, but I'm sure you're all very busy. But just wanted to tell everyone about that, because I think it's important that we bring this message back to our students, because the message all of last semester for me was, even though you can't vote, you can work at a poll. You can call people to vote. You can help people register to vote. And now that we're in between, we're almost up to the midterms again, but there's ways to get involved. And the ERA is such an amazing way to get involved, right?
I wanted to just chime in too to say, and Joanne had this question in the chat, it's important to understand that the Equal Rights Amendment is really just a beginning. You know, we have the 14th Amendment, and it does include prevent discrimination on the basis of race. We still have racism. Hate to break it to you. I know on this chat, I'm sure, is surprised by that, but many people are. Once we get the Equal Rights Amendment, we will still have sexism. It will still exist. Unfortunately, it's not an edict that will abolish sexism the next day. The reason why it's important to get Gen Z involved in the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment is by the time we get it, Gen Z is actually going to be the generation that are going to implement it and make it what we want it to be. What I tell people is the Equal Rights Amendment, you know, a lot of people are uneasy about the current composition of the Supreme Court when it comes to women's rights. But the Equal Rights Amendment will outlive every person currently on the Supreme Court. In fact, the Equal Rights Amendment will outlive every person on this Zoom and actually every person in the country today. It will be here in 100 years. It will be here in 200 years. It will be here in 300 years. The Equal Rights Amendment is a permanent amendment to the US Constitution. We don't know in 300 years what the conception is going to be of sex and gender, but we do know that we've kind of given that tool to the next generation. And the reason they have to know about it and why it's not just fun for them to learn about in a history lesson. They have to know about it because they are going to be the ones who are going to make it what we want it to be. It actually won't be anything until, and that's the next two clauses of the Equal Rights Amendment. So the second clause is actually a clause which allows Congress to enforce the Equal Rights Amendment. So it gives a whole new hook for legislators to make new laws and better laws and more strict laws to protect women. And we can talk about some of those examples if folks want to, of laws that we can't get, that we could get if we had an Equal Rights Amendment. There are many. And then the other thing is the third clause of the Equal Rights Amendment, which is actually a 2-year enactment period. And we can argue about when that enactment period, is it January 27th when Virginia ratified? Is it 2 years from that date? Is it 2 years from, okay. So we can argue about when the 2-year enactment period starts. But when the 2-year enactment period starts, really that was envisioned as a time period for state and local governments and the federal government to do an audit of their laws and to get rid of laws that are on the books that are sex discriminatory. And so it's a process. It's going to be a process, and a lot of that will have to be litigated. And like I said, could take years, if not generations. But that's why it's important, actually vital, that Generation Z know about and invest in the Equal Rights Amendment, because it's for them and they'll make it what it's going to be.
Yeah. And can I just chime in? I want to, Kate makes me think, because not only it won't be over once we get it into the Constitution, but right now you can start lobbying your legislators, your state legislators, to carry and pass laws that will mirror what we want the ERA to do. For example, anything that is discriminatory against women, such as non-equal pay, if you don't have an equal pay bill in your state, then ask somebody to sponsor it. And anybody who's ask them, do they support it? I have a bill this time. I wish it had been my idea originally, but it wasn't. It was one of my constituents that brought me a bill that said, can you carry this bill that will require boards, corporations that do business in Nevada to have a certain number of women on their board? Mm-hmm. And so we have a bill for that. The other bill that someone asked me about said, well, how do you know if people, are doing the right thing? So I got a bill for a diversity audit. And the corporations, it's not somebody that the CEO, delegates, because the information is going to come back to the legislature and whatever we need to do to fix it. While we're waiting, get people who are already elected to carry the kinds of legislation we will need after it's enacted. And if your state allows you to run for office and serve at the age that you currently are, or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, then get ready and run. Get ready and run, because we need people like you in those places who will understand and who will get it,
I 100% yes. And that's what inspires pretty much all of us in this room tonight is, you know, basically creating an environment for young people to feel empowered with knowledge and then activated to make the change in their respective communities. And it could be on multiple levels, and it can change throughout their lifetimes. And that's why I love rallying around the Equal Rights Amendment and teaching about it. And I also thank Kate and you for saying that this is just the beginning. And I think that's really important lesson to teach young people. That getting the Equal Rights Amendment adds the Constitution is not the end of the story. Close the book. Everyone's happy. It's just the beginning. And I think it's important to teach young people about endurance and wherewithal and sticking to it. And once you get one goal accomplished, thinking about the next one, because the fight for equity and equality never stops, right? It just doesn't stop.
And
right?
I think the important thing about movements is your goal is the goal, but all along the way, you are learning, you are forming connections, you are building community, you are making things better. So, you know, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was incredible, but the movement that built and really made that happen is the important part. Now we see Black Lives Matter and other movements that have been fighting for racial justice and equity. And I think, you know, with the women's movement, there hasn't been a real cohesive nationwide movement that has a specific goal for a long time. Some would argue since 1972, or at least 82. And so I think another thing for me is helping people understand that we still need a women's movement, that's not over, and that we didn't get the ERA. And so there are many things that are left undone. And I think a lot of younger people are now learning that. You know, they thought like, oh, I'm equal, like I can do whatever I want. And I think a lot of folks in the younger generation are realizing we actually still need a women's movement.
Which is the perfect segue to, I hope we can ask can we do one more question, Kate and Senator? So that's a perfect segue to Liz's question. I have not forgotten your question, Liz, about that viral video that we saw. I think it was the beginning of the week, but time doesn't exist for me anymore. It could have been 2 weeks ago. Liz, you had a question about the NCAA and the ERA and women's sports. Do you want to jump in if you're still here and ask it?
It wasn't really a question. It was just an idea for teachers that you can use
cool.
a point and a hook. That is something kids are going to have an immediate reaction, have something to say. And that's a launching point to have this discussion about the historical context and the Equal Rights Amendment and women's vote and all these other issues. They can see that very clearly. And the idea that you have to use your agency. You have to use your agency. You have to, this is why civics is important. This is why using media has been used in these different pushes for equality, because no way that damn NCAA was going to do anything had it not been for her putting that public pressure on there, and then Dick's coming in and donating all that stuff. Yeah, no, they don't get to commended for doing that. The only reason they did that is because they were shamed into that. And that is how you use your agency to bring attention to stuff leading to change. And so using that as the vehicle and saying, hey, look, this is still going on today. You guys need to hold the people in your lives and communities accountable, whether it's going to your school board about things you're seeing on your campuses, going to your cities, contacting your state and federal representatives, and instilling upon them that need for them to carry on the fight. And like Tim had the good trouble, we love Lewis, and his mantra has been a mantra of our class for a long time. Like, you got to remember the good trouble, and you got to keep doing it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and as many concrete examples that we can provide to young people, the better. And we sadly still have a lot of them, and I think it's important to highlight them. So it's 8:06. I don't want to keep people too long. I just want to thank everyone for joining tonight. This conversation could go on for hours and hours if I had my way. And maybe we can do this another time soon when we have good updates about the Equal Rights Amendment. But I can just say that you both gave me even more ideas about ways to integrate the Equal Rights Amendment into my curriculum, into my lessons. And I just want to thank you so much for taking the time out to talk about this today, and for all your work around not just the Equal Rights Amendment, but just rights in general. So thank you. And human beings in general, thank you for all you do for human beings, because that's what this is really about. So I just wanted to get concluding remarks from Kate Kelly and then Senator Spearman, and then I'll toss it back to Vicki, and she'll tell you that everything in the chat will live on, and she'll share it with you, and more information like that. So Kate, just final remarks for this amazing group who joined us tonight, and then Senator Spearman, and then we'll say goodnight for now.
Everyone here is incredible. You're doing incredible work. The way that you're integrating these lessons with students. I'm thinking back to my middle school, and I'm like, wow, my teachers definitely didn't tell me to make good trouble. So I appreciate what you're doing for your classrooms and for your students. And I think I put the link to my chat, my podcast in the chat. I have an entire season about the Equal Rights Amendment with all these specific issues. So if you had something particular that you wanted to know more about, and then the entire second season is about reproductive rights and the Equal Rights Amendment, which is another huge topic that is important to know about when it comes to this. So I would say, kids get this. It's actually easy to understand once they get past the hurdle of, wait, we don't have rights in the Constitution. What's wrong with you? And why didn't you get this into the Constitution earlier? Once you get past the hurdle of helping them understand it's not in the Constitution, it's actually a no-brainer. It's very, very easy for them to understand. And I think there's lots of examples, everyday examples that you can use about men and women. I mean, it's just, you can show them a seating chart of Congress. And, even in the highest peak that we're in now, 24% of congressional representatives are women. And so I think there's lots of very easy examples of how men and women are treated differently in our society. And I think connecting those to constitutional equality and connecting those, the last thing I'll say is when you teach about the Constitution, I think it's important to understand who wrote the Constitution. And again, this is a very easy lesson because all you have to show is a picture of the people who wrote the Constitution. And you can say, what do you notice? What are the similarities in these people? And the thing that you can just notice from a picture is that all of the people who wrote the Constitution are men. All of the people who wrote the Constitution are white. You can't tell from the picture, but they kind of look rich, and so they were land owning, wealthy. These were like the Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates of the day. They were some of the richest people on planet Earth who were writing this Constitution with a very specific goal in mind, which was to protect them and to protect their assets. And their assets were also people. And so I think that's an important thing to understand. So when you teach about the Constitution and who wrote it, it's very easy to understand why women were left out. And then I think that leads you to the next point of how are we going to fix that?
Thank you so much. Senator Spearman?
So I'll pick up where Kate left off. I've been inspired again. I don't know how many of you all noticed, but Nevada became the first female majority legislature in the country in 2019. And guess what? In 2021, we're still there. And I don't think anyone else is there. And I mentioned that because when you look at the picture that Kate talked about, all men, white men, and then you start to look at the world around you today, it doesn't look like that at all. And that tells you that a lot of things have changed. But unless you have people that represent the world around you, then the laws and things that they pass will always be antiquated, and they will always be trying to protect their privilege. I would just invite you to go to the Nevada State Legislature's website, and you'll see the kind of things that we're dealing with now. Last session, we dealt with passing a bill that allowed women to get 12 months contraceptives. And during the hearing, one of the men on the committee said, well, I don't think we should do this, because if you give them 12 months, you give them all of that birth control, then they'll probably sell it. And I'm like, dude, come on. And so, I mean, that's what you have when you don't have, women representing most of the people, because most of the people are women. This time around, our majority leader is carrying a bill that will allow for the self-administration of hormonal contraceptives. We have a bill that will allow women who were sexually abused as children to bring charges. It doesn't matter whether they were sexually abused at 6 and now they're 60, but they can bring charges. Last session, we had a bill that took away the statute of limitations if DNA was involved, because most of the time it's women who are trying to get their day in court. We also had a bill that looked at sex trafficking and prostitution, and for people who are arrested and you can determine during the arrest period that, oh, wait a minute, she's not a prostitute, she's actually a victim. You have to stop the arrest at that time and call one of the social workers that's on call and have that person linked up with them. And you don't treat them like a criminal, but you treat them like a victim and get them SNAP, get them Medicaid, get them whatever they need to start their life over. And those are the kinds of things that happen when you have a legislative body that represents the people of that state or even the people of that country. So I would invite you again, take a look at Kate was right. Take a look at that picture and then put up a picture of the way the world looks today, and it looks nothing like that. So what you want to do is you want to say old, new. And if we don't have this one, then we have to work towards it. We've got to work towards a legislative body that looks like the people that they represent. Because if they don't, they cannot look through the lens of your lived experience and understand what you're going through. That's what we need. That's what we need.
And this is, I know we're on a time crunch.
Yeah.
I just want to add one more thing to what
do.
Pat said. She's inspiring me too, and is the most inspiring person in the ERA movement. I think we can all agree. But that also wasn't the picture at the time. You know what I mean? Like even at the time, the majority of people on this continent were Native people, and also enslaved people who were brought from Africa. And so, even at the time that those men were writing this Constitution, that's not what the world looked like. That's what power looked like. And they created that system to preference themselves, but there were entire Native nations. And actually, the U.S. Constitution is largely inspired by the Iroquois Confederacy and the great law that they had. And again, there's more resources, and I put the curriculum link to the podcast in the chat. But it's important when we think about that picture that we don't think in that day there were only men. And like only white men existed, and they traipsed around in stockings across this great land. In that time, there were more people of color in this country, on this land, than white people. And so the picture then and the picture now is completely different than the picture of people in power.
I'm going to leave it there, but I wanted to chime in, but I'm going to stop myself because I wrote what I wanted to say in the chat. This is a whole other conversation I want to have another time, just about how the history is written, how it's portrayed, and our power as educators to not teach what's in the textbook. We don't have to. We can teach the curriculum and add all of this amazing information about the story of America in it as well. We have that power, and we have to do it if we really want to do justice to the education of Gen Z. Love saying it. So thank you so much for this amazing conversation tonight. Inspiring, empowering, and I know I can't wait to go back to my students tomorrow and share some of the conversations we had and the resources that everyone's sharing.